We're going to begin. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center, and we are very deeply honored and equally pleased to have with us here today Juan Carlos Botero. Juan Carlos Botero is a noted writer as a novelist, a short story writer, an essayist, and a journalist. He's won a number of very prestigious awards, including the Juan Rulfo Award for Short Stories in 1986. His work ranges over a wide range of areas as a novelist, as an essayist, and as a journalist. He has a deep intellectual curiosity, and that really shows in the range of his work. We're particularly pleased and honored that today he will be speaking about his latest book, The Art of Fernando Botero. We, on this campus in particular, I know many of you more generally, are well aware of Fernando Botero's unique role as an artist, a defining role, an iconic role throughout much of the world, whether it's Latin America, Asia, Europe, or elsewhere. But in particular, Fernando Botero has a relationship with the University of California at Berkeley. We were very, very honored to be the first public institution in the United States to show his Abu Ghraib paintings. He, in a rather unusual and deeply moving act of generosity, has donated 60 of these works of art, 60 paintings and drawings, to the University of California, Berkeley. And they now reside at the Berkeley Art Museum on campus. So with that, Juan Carlos Botero will speak and show some slides about his latest book, The Art of Fernando Botero, and then we will have time to take questions and comments afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Juan Carlos Botero.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. I want to thank Berkeley, the Center for Latin American Studies, and especially, obviously, Professors Harley Shaken and Beatriz Mans for their friendship, their kindness, and their generosity. I wonder if this is... Okay. I have to begin with an apology. English is not my native language, so you'll hear me stumble more than once. I'm sometimes trying to translate the words in my mind. And also, during this presentation, I will refer to the artist as sometimes my father, sometimes the artist. For me, it's one and the same, but just so there's no confusions. I think that when approaching this artist's work, people mostly focus on what's perhaps most evident. That he's a very popular and famous artist known around the world. That maybe he has more books published than any other living artist, or more exhibitions than, I'm sorry, but this isn't working quite probably correctly. I have to move this from here.
Moving too quickly?
It's not moving when I tell it to move. It's disobedience. Okay. Perhaps that his sculptures have been exhibited in more than 20 cities around the world, in 5 continents, and that his paintings have been shown in many of the most important museums in the world. Maybe that would be a better idea. Thank you. Or perhaps that his works sometimes make record sales at the auction houses, something like this one. In my opinion, perhaps these facts confirm his success and popularity, but they do not explain his relevance, his significance, or his importance as an artist. What does? We can say that Fernando Botero is amazingly disciplined, hardworking, and prolific. What I find even most amazing still is that he works, even at the age that he has, he's going to be, in April, he's going to be 80 years old. He works easily 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day standing up. It's very ironic because when he goes to a cocktail party or after an hour, he's exhausted, but when he's standing doing his work, he forgets completely about his surroundings. It reminds you a little bit of what Picasso said, that when an artist enters the studio, he has to leave the body outside. And that's what happens with Botero. When he enters the studio, you see that he's in a world of his own, and he's totally into his creative process. However, even if he's prolific and even if he's amazingly hardworking, etc., other artists I know are sometimes equally hardworking, equally disciplined, and many of them do not achieve this level of recognition or prestige. Therefore, the question remains, what is then the real explanation, or what are the reasons that explain the importance of Botero? I think the first reason, the most important one, is that Fernando Botero has created a style, one that is unique, original, and instantly recognizable. As with all great masters, his style is made up of his convictions. Truth in art is relative, he always says. Because of that, what matters is the artist's convictions. In other words, in every work of art, or perhaps better put, every work of art is composed of many elements. And every element in turn depends on a decision. In other words, the artist has to decide if the work is going to be figurative or abstract. What kind of materials is he going to use? Is there going to be color present or not? Or is the color going to be luminous or subdued? What kind of elements are going to be in the content, if it's going to be symbolic or not? Each of these decisions are made according to an idea, are made according to a conviction that the artist has. An idea based on what art is or should be according to their own criteria. Their ideal regarding perhaps composition, line, form, beauty, sensuality, color, content, etc. That's why my father says, with his wry sense of humor, that the real test of an artist, I'm sorry, you have to forgive me, this is working strangely. That the real test of an artist is a test of an orange. What does he mean by that? Perhaps the simplest form that exists in nature is the spherical shape of an orange or an apple. However, when we see an apple painted by Mantegna, for example, we clearly distinguish it from one painted from Picasso, from Cézanne, from Bellini, or Van Gogh. Why? Because what we actually see in the canvas, more than a particular fruit, is a style, and we recognize it in an instant. In other words, what we observe, besides the fruit, of course, is the sum of the artist's ideas, the totality and the complexity of his or her intuitions, opinions, and beliefs that go into the art, that differentiate the work from other creators, and that make them paint in such a way and not in another. As Botero always says, each one of my works, each one of my canvases is a manifest, a declaration of principles. This means that when you are capable of painting the simplest form in nature, and not only see in that image a fruit, but also a style, a collection of ideas and a long life of years of pondering and reflection condensed in that basic form, and instantly recognize it, then the artist has truly achieved something unique and admirable. Because as my father says, An artist's style is the most important contribution that he or she can make to the history of art. Now, ironically, his style has nothing to do with what is usually thought, which is fatness or obesity. To believe that, in my opinion, is just as mistaken as to say that Rubens painted fat people, or Giacometti and El Greco painted thin people, or that Uccello painted as well fat people, or that Picasso distorted people's faces. Fernando Botero says that when one observes a work of art, it is important that the person determine from where do they derive the aesthetic pleasure. For some, that delight springs from the beauty of the colors. For others, from the harmony of the lines of composition. For others still, from the content, from the story that is told in that image, or perhaps its symbolism, or its religious or historical anecdote that it represents. For Fernando Botero, his pleasure and what he most admires and enjoys in the sublime classical art of the great masters is the beauty of form, the sensuality of volume, the heroic and monumental quality that we witness in those magnificent paintings of the Renaissance. He obviously tries to emulate that same idea in his own works, but taken to an extreme, which is permitted with the freedom and audacity granted by modern art. That is why volume, which is very different from something being fat, of course, in his art achieves such a crucial presence. The importance of the form in Botero's work cannot be understated. Volume communicates sensuality. It awakens the desire of touch. It generates aesthetic pleasure. It allowed the optical illusion of depth, the three dimensions painted on a flat surface, and therefore creating a powerful, compelling, and enticing mirror of reality. That is why volume reigns supreme throughout the history of painting, from Giotto and Piero della Francesca and the entire Renaissance to Rubens and Ingres, just to name a few, right up until the 20th century.
Is it advancing better now?
I'm using my hand, it's fine.
Okay, great.
Thank you for calling. In Botero's art, everything is painted in that voluminous style. The flies, the silverware, the people, the fruits, and even the skeletons. I think what is the most striking characteristic of Fernando Botero's work is his stylistic coherence, that everything is done in that same style. For example, in his painting of 1978, La Mona Lisa, we can see exactly what the definition of his style is. I think that one of the most brilliant insights that Fernando Botero had was to understand the benefits of visual contrast, not between thin and fat, but between small and grand. For example, in this painting, the small volcanoes on the background, the small hands, and the small details of the mouth and the nose enlarges the image due to the visual contrast and increases the sensation of monumentality to the point where her face almost resembles a moon and her entire figure recalls a colossal mountain. This poetry of volume and form is Botero's priority. Here the subject is clearly Leonardo da Vinci's, but the style is clearly Botero's. Now I've heard many times a valid question. Why does Fernando Botero not change styles as Picasso did? Is he not repetitive? We must say that, first of all, Picasso was an exception in the history of art, and also I truly believe that Picasso changed styles less often than people actually realize. Also, the truth is that the most artists of practically the entire history of art into the 20th century, they did exactly the opposite. They insisted in their convictions. The maturity of their ideas led them to continue the path they had begun. For For example, Giotto, Caravaggio, Botticelli, Rembrandt, Vermeer, or Leonardo, in their case, their coherence was so unswerving. They insisted on the virtues of their respective style to the point that something that Fernando Botero says quite often, when you compare the works of their younger periods from the mature periods, it's very hard to distinguish which belongs to what, because the style has maintained itself. They have insisted in their convictions instead of changing them. That's why Fernando Botero always says, if I were to change styles, I would first have to change my ideas, my convictions of what art is. So let's say that the first element that's, I think, explains his relevance is that the fact that he created an original, unique, and instantly recognizable style. Another one is that he's incredibly prolific. He's a master of different techniques, and he has a true obsession with quality. Instead of being exclusively a painter, a sculptor, or a draftsman, as most artists are, he is accomplished in all three mediums. And he does this with amazing technique. He does oils, watercolors, pastels, charcoal, sanguine, pencil drawing, and ink works. He has done pastels in large format, drawings on canvas, and even frescoes, for example, like these that are in Italy, following very, very closely the original technique of the Italian Trecento and Quattrocento. But I'm serious. I mean, he actually discovered the journals and the diaries of the painters, and he would interpret, because they would say, take a measurement of blue cobalt of the size of 2 peas, and so he would translate that to be able to do the frescoes that are in Italy exactly with that technique of that time. Why this obsession with quality? Because in the arts, Fernando Botero believes, the only thing that survives, that passes the test of time, is excellence. Contemporary art, in his opinion, when you see it, perhaps you can be surprised 1 or 2 or maybe 3 times. But he always asks, why do we go to the great museums to see the same works as always? Why do we always go back to see the Velázquez or the Goyas or the Vermeers? Because what we find, and we're always surprised, is the quality. Quality is the only thing that truly always surprises us. That's why in his work, he has this obsession of creating works of quality. No matter the medium, each work must be a jewel. Obviously, some works are better than others, but his intention in all dominates, is the same, to create a work of quality. As he says quite often, one doesn't paint to make more paintings. One paints to solve the problems of painting. His constant desire is to make new discoveries, and he does this by applauding the resources not only offered by modern art, but also those offered by the art of painting when it achieved its highest level of excellence, which was the Renaissance. I must say that he's a permanent student of art, constantly. He's always exploring, always discovering, to the point that, for example, he found in the correspondence of Ingres wrote a letter to a friend saying that he had discovered the technique by which Velázquez painted his works. And he goes on to describe this technique. And so what my father did is that he took that technique of Velázquez and he made this painting with the subject matter of Velázquez, obviously the Meninas. And it's just an exercise in style. He did it to learn the technique of Velázquez. He's never sold this painting. They've offered it many, many times large amounts of money, but he's never accepted. He's never even signed the work because he doesn't believe that it's real Botero. It has more Velázquez than Botero, but it's an incredible work of art, but it's done just as an exercise in style. Another factor I think that explains his significance is that his exhibitions have been new. Instead of what has always happened before, that people have to go to the park or to the gallery, to the museum to see the work of art, now the work of art goes to the people. I think that's been very, not only democratic, but very, very important. It produces an immediate contact with the people, with the public. And what's most admirable, I find, is that his works can sustain the comparison of these atmospheres without being dwarfed. because most of these cities in which he has exhibited these works, they're so grand and magnificent. The settings, the surroundings are so extraordinary that I think that a minor work would be totally crushed by the architecture, by the grandiose, by the history, the grandiosity of these atmospheres. I remember when he did his exhibition in New York in 1993, he put 14 sculptures down Park Avenue. What the critics said was that these works had such power that that even if they were surrounded by these intimidating skyscrapers, they behaved in a familiar way. They looked like they'd been there their entire life. So to be able to support, to accept that confrontation without being crushed, I think it's something very unique. Another factor that critics usually point out is that Fernando Botero's work is firmly rooted in the great artistic traditions of the past. I think he had two key insights here. First, he understood that if an artist forms part of a tradition, that does not exclude his own originality. Not by being part of a tradition, you renounce your originality. On the contrary, the second insight was that those traditions offer very, very solid pillars on which to construct your work. I think what the critics always first say about Fernando Botero is that his work is very, very strong and powerful, and that it's not subject to the change of fashions that will blow his work away with a south wind, because it's very, very firmly rooted in the great artistic traditions of the past. He has admired many traditions, and for years, he copied paintings in the great museums, not only to learn the techniques, but also to feed himself, because he would sell them and he would live on this for a while. He has studied in depth Dutch and Flemish painting, French painting, Spanish and German art, colonial art, pre-Colombian art, popular art. But his work is chiefly influenced by the Renaissance, especially the art of Florence of the 1400s. His principal master, as we all know, is Piero la Francesca. That's why many of his most salient characteristics derive from this incomparable tradition. For example, the serenity of his characters, the luminous color of his canvases, the stillness of his figures, even in action, which seem to suggest or allude to a timeless space and eternity, the supreme importance of volume and the monumentality of the forms, the geometric precision of the composition, the sensuality of the images, the formal elegance of the work, the predominating atmosphere of calm and placidity, the expressionless features of the characters, obviously except in two exceptions in his work, which are the paintings of the violence and the paintings of Abu Ghraib. But normally, his characters have this expression in which they seem to look outside at the same time they look inside, more or less like what we see with Egyptian art. And the fact, also a very important lesson from the Renaissance, that each object has its own color, and that the light is never external but internal. What does that mean? You never see in the work of Botero the light entering from a diagonal angle and illuminating the surface. All his works, the light comes from inside. Even the light bulbs don't collaborate and produce any additional light. Each light bulb, it has their own light that coming from the inside of the colors, which I think is an incredible achievement in terms of aesthetic virtuosity. There's another important reason that explains Fernando Botero's relevance. He has created his own world, a vast universe filled with animals, objects, and characters. It's an original cosmos, populated quite literally with hundreds of people, of faces, of bodies. Another aspect that I think is very important, and I think for me it's what I find most revolutionary nowadays, is that his art gives pleasure, which is not something that you always find in contemporary art. It is fair to say that artists like, for example, Chagall, Bonnardo, Matisse, and even Picasso were exceptions in that aspect. And as we all know, they were fiercely criticized for doing so. That's why my father always has two favorite quotes. One is from Poussin in the 17th century when he said, "Painting is an expression upon a flat surface with forms and colors to give pleasure." And the other quote he always remembers is of Matisse. "What I dream of is an art of balance, of purity, and serenity devoid of troubling or depressing subject matter, a soothing, calming influence of the mind, rather like a good armchair which provides pleasure and relaxation." Now let's change subjects for a second and let's go into the themes, the subject matter of Fernando Botero. When I finished this book, the most important subjects I thought were 6. From the time I finished this book to right now, he's done 2 more series, so it's now 8. It's encouraging. His most important subject matter, without a doubt, is Latin America. This, I'm sorry, this is a photo of Medellin. It doesn't say it, but it's a photo of Medellin at night. We must remember that to choose Latin America as a subject matter was not an evident or an easy choice. Most of his contemporaries were turning their backs on their own reality. Very few thought their world was worth painting or writing about, and they looked to Paris or New York with admiration. Botero's case has always reminded me, I must say, of William Faulkner's. Not only because they both marched against what was fashionable at the time, and they strived to recapture the past, but because they both understood that their small speck of land was indeed valid subject matter. You all know the famous quote of Faulkner: "Beginning with Sartoris, I discovered that my own little postage stamp of native soil was worth writing about, and that I would never live long enough to exhaust it." In this sense, one cannot overstate the importance of Mexico in Fernando Botero's career. He arrived in the mid-1950s, and the time he spent there was absolutely crucial. First of all, because in Mexico, what happened is that he discovered his style. He had been working many years, but one day, while he was preparing an exhibition that was going to take place in Washington, after many days of working obsessively, he drew a mandolin, and he painted the hole in the middle, the hole that produces the sound, very small. And at that moment, he saw that the whole form exploded in his face. The whole image had increased, had acquired such a degree of monumentality that he understood that that's what he had been searching for his entire life. And from there, he insisted and persisted, insisting on his convictions. Another reason why Mexico was so important for him is that, well, first of all, Mexico was the only country at that time in Latin America that had an independent and important artistic movement. But also because Mexican artists confirmed this choice of subject matter. They tackled contemporary issues. They didn't hide away from the past. On the contrary, you see the murals of Diego Rivera, and they deal with the revolution of Mexico of 1810 and 1910. They dealt with social injustices, racial discrimination, but all done, especially in the cases of Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and Rufina Tamayo, without the content overshadowing the art. For all of them, beauty and aesthetic pleasure was their priority. So in his obsessive search for his own identity as a person and as an artist, the Mexican mural painters were their deep roots in colonial and pre-Columbian art, with strong ties to popular art, including its festive colors, its humor, its myth, its stories, the essence of a people, helped Fernando Botero a great deal. It is at this point that the explosion of color appears in Botero when he lives in Mexico. All this allowed him to create a personal interpretation of Latin America, one that dominates his work. Even his still lifes are Latin American. For there you do not find the items that we usually see in a European painting, but the foods of our continent, with their brilliant colors, popular delicacies like a pig's head or dangling chicken like we see here. Instead of oysters, you see beans. Instead of a champagne bottle, you will find a pot of coffee. Botero's vision of Latin America, and that he has created and filled with many, many characters. It's interesting to see that we find all the professions of Latin America here. We find lawyers, prostitutes, presidents, cardinals, servants, soldiers, policemen, men and women, boys and girls, young and old, rich and poor. Nevertheless, in Latin America, it seems that two main themes were for him very, very important. The first one was religion. This was a brave decision of Fernando Botero to tackle this theme, because not many artists in the 20th century had focused their attention on religion. Let's remember that the subject of religion, for example, a case like Chagall or Georges Rouault, there are exceptions in the 20th century. Picasso just did one crucifixion, Bacon did a few popes and a few crucifixions, but it's been an abandoned subject matter. What my father finds incomprehensible is that religion was the subject matter of almost all art done in Latin America and throughout the history of painting until the arrival of the 20th century. Until then, more than 90% of art had religion as a central theme, just as volume did, until they both lost their predominance at the same historical moment with the arrival of abstract art. Fernando Botero wished to reclaim both elements, which have been so crucial to the great traditions of Western art. For Botero, as well, this subject was a link, a bridge to antiquity, since the Catholic Church in the Italian Renaissance was just an important and powerful institution as in the Latin America of the 20th century, an influential, omnipresent institution, active in politics, in society, in our culture, and in our private lives of the people, a fundamental actor and a player in our world. Also, because the only people, as he's fond of saying, who still dress like in the Middle Ages are the priests, the nuns, and the popes. In any case, this subject matter served Botero in two ways. It allowed him to gain access to one of the richest artistic traditions in our history, and thus prolong it with his own contributions. This tradition that was nurtured with the works of the greatest painters since the Middle Ages. But it also allowed him to paint and capture many times with a satirical intention one of the most important and most influential institutions of his land and of his time. The other theme that Fernando Botero discovered as an essential element of Latin America, and that also permitted it to join the rich traditions of the past, as well as the reality of his own time, was politics. In Botero's life, political power in Latin America has been held in the hands of civilians and, more famously, the military. Here again was a material that served as a link, as a bridge, with strong bonds with the past, and which offered a fine excuse to create, also many times with satire, a feast of colors and forms. Indeed, many of his favorite masters had painted this theme, the political element, and not only during the Renaissance, but also in France and Spain, as we see here in this painting, the official portrait of the military junta of 1971, where the composition closely resembles Goya's famous work of 1800, La Familia Carlos IV. The satire and the symbolism in this painting are inescapable. Here we glimpse an entire social commentary. The supreme commander is in scene center stage, towering over the rest of the other characters just as he did over the rest of society. To one side, we find a representative of the cavalry, which had been so important in our past and is now reduced to an almost comical dimension. The wife, next to her husband, is pretty, quiet, and submissive, not much more than a decorative figure, almost like a doll. And through her, we feel the presence of the whole machista culture of Latin America, which has been so destructive for our continent. We also suspect that the little boy is being held there by the nanny, is clearly in the line of succession and he will probably grow to be just as big and ruthless as his general father. And the whole military institution, this is not by chance, it's very deliberate, is quite literally backed by the Catholic Church, just as happened with deplorable consequences in Latin America, which is incredibly ironic because the institution that was the guardian of our faith and of our morality ended up legitimizing with their blessing many of these leaders that, as we all know, were more often than not simply butchers more than anything else. These are the other two paintings of the political matter, political subject of Botero, and it's impossible not to see them and think of a banana republic, especially with the leaves in the back. Then in the mid-1980s, Fernando Botero began a new series of paintings, all related to the Fiesta Brava, or the bullfight. This is very ironic, because the first thing he had ever painted in his life were bulls. He even did a few watercolors, and he put them to sell in the Plaza de Toros in Medellin. And it was incredible that somebody bought them. And the guy who sold the tickets said to him, "Hey, listen, somebody bought one of your watercolors." And he gave him a peso and said, "This is your earnings." My father was so excited that he ran to the house to tell his brothers that he had made money selling a work of art. He lost the money on the way. And he was 15 at the time. But from then he sustained his entire family by painting. In any case, seen in retrospect, what's surprising is that it took so long to come back to this road that had been actually for him his beginning. This reminds me of the verse of T.S. Eliot, that you probably all know. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." In any case, in 1984, he did his first painting of this theme and immediately discovered an entire universe at his disposal. Of course, there was a few challenges with this subject matter. The bull ring space is quite different than he had done before, without the horizontal line that had characterized his previous works, but a closed area with a circular scenario. The plaza is drastically divided between sun and light, sol y sombra, but in Botero's work, shadows are almost non-existent due to his firm convictions that shadows smudges the color. And in his art, what we see, what we most appreciate, what we most enjoy, on the contrary, is the fullness, the vitality, and the purity of his colors. Also, a bullfight is a constant dance, a permanent choreography of movement that only ends when the last ball falls to the ground and when the spectators leave the seats. But in Botero's art, there is no movement. And what predominates is a just suggestive stillness, the calm figure and the frozen gesture preserved in time as if for all eternity. However, this new world offered distinct advantages. He knew this material very well because he's a real expert on bullfighting. He's a true aficionado. This material also allowed him to join a noble tradition that had been dignified by the great works of the past, by Francisco de Goya, Pablo Picasso, Eduardo Manet, Salvador Dali, and Francis Bacon. In other words, this subject matter offered solid pillars on which to construct his own art. Also, this new world allowed him to insist in his identity as a Latin American, to go even deeper within his own world and to increase the number of his characters, to populate his world again, to add a new chapter to his universe. And not only the people who participate in the bullfight, also all the people who gravitate around this fascinating world, the musicians, the dancers, the flamencos, the people, even as we'll see, the dwarves. Something that's very interesting about these paintings is that most of them show a wrong pass in terms of technique of the bullfighting. This is deliberate, and it's happened before with Goya. When you see Goya's paintings of the bullfight, as my father says, they're called trapazos infames, which are terrible passes, but they're magnificent Goyas. For Fernando Botero, you have to keep in mind, for him, his priority is the aesthetic dimension, more than the actual representation of reality. For him, what's important is the work of art function as a work of art, more than if it creates or duplicates a true, the true technique of the mastery of bullfighting. This is not always the case. For example, in this drawing we see, this is the arrastre. In this drawing we see a Veronica done with all the rigor of the technique of bullfighting. But this debate between reality and fiction reminds me of that famous anecdote of Kenneth Clark when he went to see the paintings of Degas with the director of the Royal Academy of Ballet, Ninette Valois of England. And while he was admiring the paintings, she would look at the paintings of Degas, of the dancers, which, by the way, very few dance in the paintings of Degas. If you noticed, most of them are before or after the dance or chatting or whatever. When she would see the people dancing, she would shout, line, line, position, position, because they were wrong in terms of the technique of dance. Kenneth Clark explained to her that, obviously, that's not what matters when you see a Degas. In any case, these paintings of the bullfight were exhibited for the first time in November 1992, and he discovered a new world, a new opportunity of feast for colors and form. Then, a few years later, Fernando Botero experienced a major shift in his beliefs. Until that time, he had always sought to celebrate life, to create an alternate space of beauty and aesthetic pleasure in what was clearly a difficult and violent world. Most art had been done around pleasant themes, and this had always been Fernando Botero's objective. Now, true artists had painted violence before, such as Matthias Grunewald in the Altar of Ilsenheim, or the nightmarish visions of El Bosco. For me, it's difficult to pronounce, Hieronymus Bosch. And also a famous painting like The Triumph of Death of Peter Bruegel, done in 1562. But as we all know, the first artist who truly painted violence with the intention to denounce, to accuse, to capture the atrocity in its true dimension was Goya. Now, it must be said, we must clarify that this subject matter was not completely new in the work of Fernando Botero. He had done this work, Crying Woman, in 1949. He had done varias predelas, like in the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, that all described, told a narrative, a story, and most of them were of violent events, like, for example, this one, the murder of Rosita Calderón in 1969. He did this painting called War, which is done with the same rigor of composition as a fruit basket or arrangement of flowers. But then in the 1990s, Fernando Botero appeared to betray his beliefs. But he's always been a realist. He's never done these paintings to change reality. He always says that, for example, one of the most powerful paintings that accuses and denounces in a very tangible way is Picasso's Guernica, done in 1937. But that painting did not prevent Franco from remaining in power for almost 40 more years. In any case, he began a series of paintings of the violence of Colombia, and he donated it almost completely to the National Museum of Bogota. I think that what happened was that the violence at that point in Colombia had risen to a degree that it was impossible for Fernando Botero to remain oblivious. Let's not go into great detail, but at that time we were experiencing more or less 30,000 violent deaths a year. When people would ask me, why is it that in Colombia people do not protest more? Why are there not more public demonstration of outrage against the atrocious violence that we experience on a daily level? Like, for example, in Spain, when ETA assassinates a fellow member of society that people take to the streets often in millions, I would always reply that if we were to do that for every violent death that occurs in Colombia, we would have to literally take to the streets between 80 and 90 times a day. Colombia at that time, one of the few countries in the world, I think, in which 4 presidential candidates were assassinated in one election, and where an entire political party, the Unión Patriótica, was literally obliterated by gunfire. In any case, Fernando Botero did this incredible series of violence with the belief that the artist is the only person that can make visible the invisible. What does that mean? It's true that he wasn't physically there, present to see these scenes, just as it's quite probable that Goya was not there on the mountain of El Príncipe Pío to capture the fusilados, which he reproduces in his incredible famous painting, the 3rd of May of 1808. By that time, Goya was 62 years old. He was already deaf and old for that time. So he probably wasn't physically present. But these artists, with what they have heard, what they have seen, what they have read, what they have listened to, what they have experienced, are capable of painting that scene that perhaps nobody saw or maybe nobody survived to tell and capture it. And that is what remains. I think that what's important is not to be able to capture a specific anecdote of history, but to try to capture the human truth that permits that anecdote and thousands like it to exist. In any case, this was a series of paintings that he did, and I know that for him it was a very important part of his career. Then, in the year 2004, in May, as you all know, especially here in Berkeley, when he heard of what had happened in the infamous prison of Iraq, when all that became public, Fernando Botero read the article of Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker, which described in detail the infamy and the tortures that the Iraqi prisoners had suffered in the hands of their American guards. He was on a plane, and he was so furious, so outraged, that he began right there and then to make his first drawings. And after 14 months of obsessive work, he concluded one of his most controversial and bravest series of paintings that he simply called Abu Ghraib. Now, the reason for Botero's outrage, along with most people of the civilized world, was that this incident was apparently not the simple case of a group of perverse soldiers mistreating their Muslim prisoners, but something much more complex, something much more important. Everything seemed to indicate that the government of the world's superpower that presented itself as a champion of human rights and a protector of human dignity had actually orchestrated a system of abuses from the highest levels. And the American troops had invaded this nation with the excuse of WMDs and with the intention of liberating the country from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, the sad and awful truth was that those same soldiers had tortured, some to the point of death, the same Iraqi people, and in the same prison where Hussein had broken the spirit of his own countrymen. This was intolerable in the eyes of Botero, and thus he began to work. As you know, these paintings and drawing have certain elements that should be underlined. In all of them, there's a closed, suffocating atmosphere. There's a closed room. There's no humor at all or satire in these works, just like in the previous series of La Violencia. Fernando Botero believes that if there had been any kind of satirical intention, that would have been a lack of respect for the suffering of these people. There are no flags or badges in the people who commit these atrocities, because he did not want this horrific episode to be limited to a specific moment in history. He wanted to, because he believes that it illustrates something that has happened before and has happened many, many times. The time that when somebody powerful crushes the person who was not powerful, and when people in power abuse that power and commit these kind of atrocities. And many, like in this painting, you can see a small white window that seems to represent perhaps an opportunity, a ray of hope, a ray of light that tries to open through this darkness of this inferno. Perhaps for me, what's most surprising about these works, in any case, is the beauty and the aesthetic pleasure that they offer. I know this is controversial, and when I say beauty and pleasure, people say, how can you talk about beauty and pleasure in this atmosphere? I know it sounds strange, but for Fernando Botero, no matter the subject matter, it can be an old pair of shoes, it could be a still life, it could be a person tortured to death. The work has to be beautiful, and it has to give aesthetic pleasure. More so, this aesthetic achievement is precisely what permits us to contemplate these works of art. If not, they would simply be intolerable. I remember once Professor Harley Shakin said that when you see these works, you cannot look away. When you're confronted with these works, you cannot look away. And I agree completely. But the reason you cannot look away is precisely because of their artistic quality, that dimension, which is absolutely extraordinary. There's some elements that serve to mitigate a bit this horrendous occurrence. First of all, there's a geometric order in all the paintings. There's the visual device of the jail bars, which serves to produce some sort of symmetry in the middle of this hell, some sort of visual order. There's another aspect which I find very important, which is the importance of color in these works. Most of the paintings are done in very monotonous tones. The grays and blacks and ochres and browns predominate. But then all of a sudden, perhaps in the undergarments that the prisoner is wearing, or the blindfold that in this case he's wearing, or the substance that's being vomited, or the yellow of the urine, you find a refreshing tone of color. And what color? I think the person approximate themselves to these works, and after a while they feel thirsty, visually thirsty for color, and then they find it. And it refreshes, it soothes. I think it's truly a remarkable effect, that singularity of color. There are two more aspects that I would like to underscore. One that I find particularly disturbing is this image of the latex glove, because the irony cannot be eluded. This is the item that doctors and dentists use to produce healing, to heal their patients. In this case, it's used for horrible, not only to participate in the torture, but to give off this terrible message. I can torture you to death, and I can do whatever I want to you, and I can do the most horrific things, but I do not want you to touch me. I don't want my hands to be dirty by the contact of your presence. I think that's the most barbarous denunciation that comes through with these works. For me, one of the most powerful paintings and one of the most powerful images is, ironically, one of the smallest, which is this one. It's number 6 of the year 2004. I think here that Fernando Botero has understood that this proximity and the imminence of pain are even worse than pain itself. And it highlights something that is rarely one sees it in modern art, which is the deliberate violence, calculated to produce the maximum effect. When you see the person holding the leash, it's almost a scientific method. How can we break this person until we allow them to die when we need to? It's almost a scientific approach to how to create the most pain and suffering. I think it's absolutely horrendous. It's an insult to the body and an affront to the soul and to the mind. These images are terrible in their frankness, I agree, without a doubt. And the lack of compassion and sanity in the hands of the tormentors indicates that the objective of this suffering was not any kind of ulterior motive. You hear those euphemisms all the time. These are the kind of excesses that sometimes people in uniform unfortunately commit. No. In this case, the objective of the torture is torture itself. That was the whole idea behind it. With something worse, in some paintings, the bars are placed, like in this case, in front of the prisoners, creating some sort of distance, a barrier between us and the brutality that's taking place in those cells of hell. We can still see everything through the bars, of course, but it is a visual device to separate the space of the spectator from the space of the painting. However, in other paintings, that barrier is situated behind the person that is being beaten and humiliated to death. And so the visual device that distances ourselves from that nightmare has disappeared. There's no space between the victim and us, since we share the same visual reality. In other words, we are not only direct witnesses to this barbarity, we are also included within it. whether we like it or not, and thus we participate in the horror. I think that Professor Shaken was right. We cannot look away, because these paintings and drawing forces to contemplate the beast, the demon that lurks and seems to hide, shrouded, dwelling in the darkest basements of the human condition, one that, when liberated from the bonds of law and reason, spurred by fear, bigotry, greed, fanaticism, or hatred, can unleash a holocaust. In any case, Botero, he said that he experienced a real catharsis doing these paintings. He liberated himself from this obsession. But I think his accusation has remained in these works, and I believe that they have remained forever. Then, quite understandably, Fernando Botero changed subject matters again, and he discovered the circus. But it's important to understand, this is not a rich circus. This is a very typical poor Latin American circus. It's not Cirque du Soleil. He was in Cihuatanejo, and he went with his wife Sofia Mari to the circus. And as soon as he entered the big top, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was such a feast of colors and forms. And he said, here I have at my disposal an entire universe again, with a great quality that this subject matter had also been worked by the great artists of the past, by Pablo Picasso, by Henri Matisse, by Renoir, by Degas, by Seurat, by Chagall, by Toulouse-Lautrec and Fernand Léger. With this formidable material, Fernando Botero could insist in his virtue, in his convictions, recapture scenes from the past and work them in a new way. For example, he had done this painting, actually it's an incredible pastel, of a woman upside down committing suicide. In Botero's work, you find a lot of fantasy and imagination, but you don't find the absurd. It's very hard to paint somebody upside down being believable. But the good thing is that in the circus, any position, any twist of the body is valid because of all the things that's going on. In these works, we find a return of humor and tenderness in the works of Botero. But there's an ambiguous feeling because these works, many of them are humorous, but they're not funny. We may smile, but in an equivocal way, for we are moved by the artist's humanity. These characters that we conceive, they have tasted defeat and the hardships of their life, and the artist is not deriding them, making fun of them from a superior position. It allowed him to recapture elements of the past. For example, animals that he had done before, the circular scenario of the bullfight, or the bull ring, the bars of Abu Ghraib, other animals that he had done before. He was able to prolong his world, but at the same time, he was able to invent new images. Every time Fernando Botero jumps into a new subject matter, he has the intention of continuity and innovation. These animals, many of them were new. These people, many of them were new. He had drawn dwarfs, he had painted dwarfs before. For example, he did a very important series based on the Boya Vallecas of Velázquez. He did more than 10 of these paintings. And he did this also in the bullfight, like this painting, the Cuadrilla of Fernando's Toreros. But he was able to do this again in the circus. One of the most incredible figures I find in this subject matter is this one, the fat woman. Here we can see clearly the difference between someone fat and a Botero. We can see this woman is obviously clearly fat. We can see the cellulite in her flesh. But the contrast she has with the other figures of Botero's work is very, very noticeable. The other figures, the volume is very terse, very soft, very sublime, very elegant. The fact that he had never painted a fat person in his life before, as he's often fond of saying, proves that his work has nothing to do with fatness and everything to do with volume. There are two more subject matters that he has done simultaneously with all the rest. One are the portraits. He has done numerous portraits. This for him is a different challenge because he cannot invent completely. There are certain limitations. He has to produce a resemblance. He has done, for example, this one of Pablo Escobar. In this one of the frescoes of Pietrasanta, you can see that he painted his wife Sofia, which is up there. He painted, unfortunately you can't see him right here, but here's the gardener that helped him prepare the work called Mario. You can see Hitler, and you can see my father painted as well in the scenes of hell, where he may think he may end up. In any case, he also painted Francisco Franco with a very, very significant painting. You can see the large chair in the back. I think the message is quite clear that power was too big for him. Also, he painted Adolfo Viña-Curt according to Caravaggio. He did a number of self-portraits, which are, I think, incredibly amusing and beautiful. This is an exception because in most of them, he has his utensils as an artist, always to prove, to demonstrate, to underscore his vocation, his craft. He's done he's painted all the members of the family. And in this case, I think that a special mention has to be done in this case of Pedrito. In 1974, after the tragic automobile accident that cost the life of my younger brother, Pedrito Botero, incredible, after so many years, it still hits me. He was only 4 years old at that time. My father tried to come to terms with his grief through his art. Fueled by his pain, he finished a series of beautiful paintings and drawings of Pedrito. 2 years later, in 1976, my father made his first donation to Colombia, 16 oil paintings to create the Hall of Pedrito Botero in the Museum of Antioquia. Here we can find many works that are truly wonderful, poetic, and moving. And among these, I would spotlight this one, Pedrito on a horse, Pedrito a caballo, where you can actually see my father and the mother of the child through the open windows, the door in the toy house. They're both dressed in mourning and facing the empty space that follows such a loss. He's done other portraits as well. He's painted a number of artists, for example, Velázquez, Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, Rubens, Delacroix, Giacometti, Courbet. However, perhaps the most important tribute and portrait is this one. It's Dinner with Angres and Piero la Francesca. I must say that this is a charcoal on canvas, and the technique is absolutely extraordinary because you have to take into consideration that the canvas is a very, very rough texture. When you pass a pencil or charcoal through it, it resembles a wire. Botero has been able to create, and he's done hundreds of these. He's been able to create, to discover technique, to draw with charcoal on canvas and create this very sensual, soft texture, very subdued, with tones of gray and light and black. It's really extraordinary. And the meaning here is very interesting and ambiguous as well. I don't know if my father's trying to say that he would wish to be able to sit down with Piero la Francesca and Angles to chat about their craft, or is he saying that he's in their leagues, or maybe for that reason he's painted smaller than the other ones. But in any case, I'm sure he would love to be able to cross the barriers of time and space and be able to sit with them, with his masters. Another type of subject matter is Europe. Europe in Botero's art is Europe a la Botero. It's not the Europe that we painted by a native European. It's, for example, these works that he painted in homage to Albert Durero, and that he even signed Durero Botero in the 1960s. He did a number of these, like this one is a bit of 1968. He's done card players resembling the card players of of Cézanne, and the picnic scenes that he's done that resemble obviously the Guatemala painting, the famous painting Luncheon on the Grass, which was originally titled, as you know, Le Ban. And I don't know if you know this or not, the original source of inspiration for this incredible image of a naked woman with a dressed man is taken from Raphael's drawing of 1518, and especially with this etching done by his disciple Marcantonio Raimondi, which is an incredible work. In any case, Europe appears in these works, for example, Louis XVI with his family in prison, or this one when you see Maria Antonietta in these two versions, or his self-portrait of Madame Pompadour, the famous legendary marquis and lover of Louis XV. His self-portrait, this is an incredible work, with Louis XIV seen by Rigaud. And this one, which is an incredible, these two works. They're side by side there in Medellin, with my father's mother actually looking over the window, which is Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette visiting Medellin, Colombia, done in 1990, like if it was the most natural thing that these kings would come from the past to walk through the streets of Medellin. However, I think the most important image of Europe that we feel in Botero's work is this one, according to Piero La Francesca. Here, Fernando Botero has taken the qualities, the virtues of Piero La Francesca, and taken them to the extreme that is permitted by modern art. These are two extraordinary works painted in the reverse order that Piero did, and much larger, much larger. Piero's measurements are 47 by 33 centimeters. The versions of Botero are 204 by 177 centimeters. Here, as you can see, all the elements of Botero's art are very, very evident. A very, very low horizon, like in the originals, like if the dukes were in front of a window with the wide open space below them. But when he lowers the horizon even still and makes it even smaller, they gain a monumental quality which is absolutely extraordinary. As Hardy was saying, this presentation is based on a book that I wrote. I divided it not only on the subject matter of Botero, but also on his artistic convictions. The reasons that I've mentioned some of you here, but there's a lot of them that I have not been able to mention that go into his work. Let me just mention one, and I think we can see it perfectly clear in a second. I think Fernando Botero's life is divided in two moments. When he was a young artist, when he did this painting, when he's searching for his style, anything that he finds interesting, he tries to incorporate in his work. And the second period of his life in which he discovers his style and insists on his convictions to this moment. The difference between one moment and the other is the maturity of his convictions. One of those convictions is what I've called the serene joy, like in this painting. And I'll finish with this. It's a painting, The House of Mariduque of 1970. This is a typical Latin American brothel, captured in a moment of enjoyment. There's a transvestite that holds in his arms one of the 4 prostitutes of the canvas. There's a man sleeping in the background, and a small grandmother that's doing her chores, sweeping the wooden floor that's covered with cigarette butts. The air is full of flies, and an apparently robust and content cat poses next to a green parrot that has stopped on its way to a banana that is half-eaten. Here, as with most works of Botero, we perceive the existence of a world. The original cosmos of the Colombian painter, drawn with his amazing imagination, his sense of humor, and his prodigious fantasy, where every single thing, the objects and the people are luminous, and where the size of the smallest figures collaborate by contrast in highlighting the immensity of the forms that surround them. It is a world where apparently people enjoy everyday life, where their clocks have stopped to grant a parenthesis of peace, pleasure, and delight, and where time remains still as if for all eternity. The climate is pleasant, the food is abundant. It's a world filled with sensuality, not eroticism. A world similar to ours, for we easily recognize it, or recognize its point of origin, which is the reality of Latin America. But at the same time, we also comprehend that it's different and poetic, enlivened by the classical and sublime air of immortality, almost of paradise. In other words, this is an imaginary and alternate world, one that softly seduces the spectator and invites them to smile and dream, and maybe for a few moments at least, abandon their own tumultuous reality and inhabit this calm, pleasant atmosphere, and maybe too, while they live here, be happy as well, not laughing or euphoric. You don't find that in the works of Botero, but filled with enjoyment and a certain kind of happiness, a serene happiness. I think that's the most important element of Fernando Botero's work, the celebration of life. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We have time for a few questions or comments. Yes.
You showed images of the sculptures, but you said very little about the sculptures. Is that included in your book?
Yes. There's a final chapter in which I describe how Botero makes his sculptures in Italy, in Pietrasanta. And it's a very interesting process. I can tell you, I think one of the things that I found that people least know is that one of the things that he does is that he works in an incredible way. He works every day. I've never seen him pass a day without working. When he does his sculptures in Italy, it's during the 3 months that he's there in Pietrasanta. And at the end, he produces a number of sculptures, and he leaves them in the form of yesos. He does them in clay first. They're converted to yeso, and he leaves them there for a year. The next year he returns, and he looks at them with coldness, and he takes a sledgehammer, and the ones that do not pass his test, he destroys immediately, and the ones that do are the ones that become bronzes that we see. It's a fascinating process.
A courageous process. Yes.
Well, I want to say that this is a beautiful book.
Thank you.
It's one of the most amazing books I have read about Botero.
Thank you.
And I feel very happy to have the book and read it. And I think so there is a part in the end that you didn't talk too much about this. Es sobre la sátira envuelta en amor.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to tell a little bit about this.
That's a very good point. I wanted to, but
Can you show the book so that you Yeah, can see what I have ordered at Amazon.
we didn't have time for that. I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of Fernando Botero's work, precisely the satire wrapped in love, because it's very interesting when you see people, the people that he accuses, the people that he's making fun of, when they go to one of his exhibitions, you see the members of the clergy, the members of the military, the members of aristocracy in front of his paintings, they don't seem offended. They don't seem offended. Why? The reason is that, or my father's explanation, which I think is very logical, is that his satire is wrapped in love. In other words, he can be rationally motivated to denounce, to accuse, to make a social commentary. But the moment he does the work, he feels so much joy painting, applying the color, composing the work, doing the forms, that love, that enjoyment is evident in the final result. And so at the end, there's an ambiguous feeling. These people, when they go to the exhibition, they see themselves portrait there, but at the same time, you see a painting that's next to it. There's a beautiful, like this one, a beautiful arrangement of flowers. And they see the artist in a self-portrait. And so they don't think that they're being insulted. In other words, the satire of Botero is effective, but it's not offensive, which I think is very specific to his case.
Any other questions or?
Will we see an English edition of the book?
I'm not sure. I'm trying to at the moment, but you know, it's very hard. English is the hardest language to be translated into. So we're working on that. I hope so.
I'd like to answer that as well. Yes. We would like to make that happen. I want to thank Juan Carlos Botero and just say one thing very briefly before we conclude. Those at Berkeley who have seen, worked on, been part of, been impacted by the extraordinary Abu Ghraib paintings owe an extraordinary debt to Fernando Botero, the artist, and Fernando Botero, the person. On both levels, I think he has deeply touched us, highlighted